Alex. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me along. My name's Ruby. I'm the National Officer for PCS in Scotland. So I work with PCS members across what we'll call the Scottish devolved sector, and I'll explain what that is in a second. So I'm just going to bring up some slides if you give me 2 seconds. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, all
Perfect.
good, amazing. So I'm going to just spend a bit of time today talking about the wins and the progress that PCS union members in the Scottish devolved sector have had on their working time in the last few years. So just firstly, just for some awareness around PCS is a union. So we are the Public and Commercial Services Union, and we are the largest civil service union in the UK. We have around 190,000 members, and the majority of these members work in like UK government employers, so HMRC, DWP, the Home Office. In Scotland, we have around 28,000 members, and again, the majority of them do work for UK government employers, but around 12,000 of those members work basically in what we call the devolved sector employers. So that's roughly about 51 employers, and they come under the authority of the Scottish Government's pay policy. And that's really important to this conversation. They are ultimately controlled by the Scottish Government, not the UK Government. So these are bodies, organisations, employers, whatever you want to call them, that are like that make up or are linked to the devolved administration. So you have, for example, the Scottish Civil Service. So that's the Scottish Government itself as an employer. You have the Scottish Prison Service, the Procurator Fiscal, the Scottish Courts and Tribunals, and Registers of Scotland. And then you have a lot of non-departmental public bodies that again still do come under the control of the Scottish Government's pay policy. So that's on employers such as the National Museums of Scotland, the National Galleries of Scotland, and bodies that are part of the environmental and land agencies and the enterprise and skills agencies. We also have a significant number of members who work for the Scottish Parliament, so they are independent of the Scottish Government, and I'll come to them later because they are part of this. So prior to 2020, the vast majority of these employers operated on a 37-hour week. There were a couple that had 42 hours as their full-time contractual hours, and there were around four bodies that were already operating on a 35-hour week, but that was a very small minority. In around 2015-ish, the mid-2010s, the PCS Scottish Sector Committee, so that was a committee that is made up of PCS representatives from these devolved sector employers, basically decided that a reduction in working time was long overdue and that PCS members could and should benefit from some of the technological advancements that they'd seen in recent years, and basically to reap some of the benefits of that. So the 28 hour, 28-hour week with no loss of pay or terms and conditions became part of the PCS Scottish sector pay claim. And in around 2016, 2017, we started negotiating around this and discussing options such as an incremental reduction from 37 or 42 hours at 5 days to 28 hours, by implementing, for example, a first step of a 35-hour week. And, as a negotiator at the time prior to 2020, I had employers like literally laugh at me when we would raise this in a meeting because they just thought like, silly utopian unions, this will never happen, this is so unrealistic. There is one notable exception to this, and it really stood out at the time, and this was an organisation called Nature Scot, who in 2018 ran a 35-hour week pilot for around 3 months, and the pilot was so successful that the word was at the time that this was basically blocked by the Scottish Government, and the permanent implementation of a 35-hour week at that time was blocked by the Scottish Government because they didn't want there to be a domino effect at the time because, there's a lot of political considerations for, working time and what this looks like. I suppose it's also safe to say that when this became part of the PCS pay claim, again, there was a lot of PCS members and activists who absolutely supported this and who knew that this could and should be done. But there was a lot of members who didn't, and that's really understandable. You know, when you talk about a thing like a 4-day week, and all of you will know this, it generates a lot of questions, it generates a lot of personal concerns. And there was a piece there that we hadn't really done in terms of educating members. And, you know, in the context of the public sector and years of austerity and, you know, changes being brought in terms of automation that had solely benefited employers, it was no wonder that a lot of members were pretty sceptical about a 4-day week. So I'll just move on. So, as we all know, pretty much 5 years ago to the day, we went into lockdown and the whole world changed pretty much overnight. And workers everywhere, including us, I'm sure, started realising that we could work in ways that we had been told for years were just not possible. And that year, you know, it was awful and the pandemic was awful. But in amongst that kind of tragedy, there was a real moment of like collective realisation that things could be different. I suppose, if the political will is there. So as we moved through the first kind of months of the pandemic, it seems like the 4-day week and a shorter working week became like a really mainstream talking point. And we had in Scotland politicians like our own First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, touting the 4-day week as a potential part of like a post-pandemic recovery. So as we moved through that year and everyone kind of like settled into home working and, you know, the pandemic just kept carrying on, we realised, PCS Scotland realised that it felt like the time to really progress our agenda on the 4-day week. And my manager at the time had been in an event with Autonomy, the think tank that like leads on this. And we engaged Autonomy to discuss a scoping project in working time within the Scottish devolved sector. So the aim of this project would be like to choose an employer that has a really diverse workforce as a test site and to speak to like the workers in there to see, you know, do you want a 4-day week? Do you think that a 4-day week would be feasible for your job? And what do you think the impact would be on if a 4-day week was implemented in your employer? So the decision was taken that the Scottish Government as an employer would be the site for the research, and Autonomy worked with PCS representatives and officials from the Scottish Government on planning for this project. Now, the reason that we chose this was because the Scottish Government as an employer at the time, I think had around 12,000 members of staff. They have more now. And across these 12,000 members of staff, there is such a diverse workforce. So you have people in the Scottish Government that do jobs such as work as meat inspectors in meat abattoirs and go and work in fishery ports or on reception desks or as security officers or policy officers. So you could actually test the 4-day week across these, you know, desk-based or field-based roles. And in addition to that, you have people who work full-time, part-time, compressed hours, people that are partially retired, people that have disabilities, people that have caring responsibilities. So our aim was to really take this research and be able to show how it's transferable and relevant across the wider public sector and for us across these devolved sector employers with, you know, with this, with transferable research. So over a 3-week period, Autonomy worked with our reps to speak to over 2,300 members of staff. And importantly, this wasn't just PCS union members. And this was done through workshops and interviews and a survey. And it was really clear to us throughout this project and in the period that follows that we had the issue, right? You know, you go and speak to anyone, union members about certain issues, some will care about them, some will care less. Sometimes people just don't care at all. Everyone wanted to talk to us about the 4-day week, and that was really apparent through the engagement that we got in that. So it's really important to know as well that this research project, you know, it was like academic led through the workforce. We also managed to organise around this. So at the time, the reason that we put this out to non-union members was to try and organise and to bring new people on, and we successfully did that. We recruited new union members, and we also recruited new activists as part of that. So it was a really great opportunity for us to educate people and to organise around that. So the results that you can see here of the survey especially were incredible for us. You know, 87% said that they supported the Scottish Government exploring the 4-day week, which is obviously no surprise that it's desirable. But very importantly for us, it showed that it is possible, with 84% of people saying that they were confident that they could adapt their current work process to suit a 4-day week. So the autonomy report was widely covered in the press throughout spring 2021. And it was sent to all MSPs as well. And throughout the summer of 2021, it was used as a tool for us to educate members. So again, we took this report and made it transferable across the wider Scottish sector. We held a webinar with hundreds of PCS members. We created FAQs and briefings, and this really generated a lot of grassroots conversations amongst our membership in those 50 odd employers that I was talking about earlier. If I could take one thing away from that time, and I've touched on it already, is that how crucial the autonomy research was to us being able to educate ourselves on the 4-day week, and for reps and negotiators to build their confidence in speaking to members, to be able to ultimately build members' expectations that this is something that you can have and you should expect to have in your working life. So at employer level, so I've spoken about, what we've kind of done there with the research with members, but at employer level at the time, negotiators started to use this to push management to explore and implement a reduction in working time across these 50 odd employers. And at government level, the report was used in discussions with government ministers and with opposition parties as well to lobby for a reduction in working time. So at this point in time, summer 2021, the SNP, as well as the Scottish Greens and the Scottish Labour Party, had the 4-day week as a manifesto commitment, and the Greens weren't yet in government as well. So we were able to kind of use that opportunity to really push them on their upcoming pay policy, and to get the Greens to push them, because the Greens basically could give them the votes to get that through Parliament when the time came. So in December 2021, the Scottish Government published its pay policy for the following year, so the 2022-23 pay policy. And for the first time, this pay policy gave employers not only the option to take part in a public sector pilot of a 4-day, 32-hour week, but also encouraged employers to implement a 35-hour week. So this was a huge win for PCS members. It's incredible to have influenced the government's pay policy in this way. However, at the time as well, you'll all recall that this was the first signs of the cost of living crisis, and inflation started to creep up, and the predictions were that that was going to get really bad throughout 2022. And so even though we'd had this win, it felt like it was kind of smothered at the time by everyone starting to realise that we were going to head into a really difficult period economically. So the talks on working time did take a bit of a pause, because the priority for us was to protect people's living standards and to focus on pay. So I'm going to move the slide on. So we moved into 2022. The last 5 years just feels like a jumble in my head of the years that have gone by. And as the cost of living crisis got worse and inflation kept rising, there was waves of industrial action up and down the UK, with unions like the RMT leading on that. And there was thousands and thousands of people joining campaigns like Enough is Enough. Throughout the first half of that year, PCS negotiators were engaged in talks with Scottish ministers to really push them on their pay policy, because that pay policy, whilst it had positive mentions of a reduction in working time, the pay metrics themselves were going to result in austerity pay, because it was nowhere near what inflation was. So there was engagement at a kind of strategic Scottish Government level with ministers to urge them to change their pay policy, and there were discussions going on at local level and negotiations with employers to push employers on this as well. In addition to this, in the first half of 2022, PCS held a national consultative ballot for industrial action. This was around March 2022, and PCS members voted in historic numbers in that consultative ballot, and sent a very clear message that if our living standards are not going to be protected by above inflation pay rises, then we are going to take industrial action. So as the year progressed and things got worse, and again, there were really no discussions on working time, PCS held a statutory ballot for industrial action in November 2022, and PCS members across the UK, but for us specifically in the Scottish devolved sector, voted in, again, historic numbers and super majorities for industrial action. When these results came out at the end of November 2022, the PCS General Secretary, Mark Sirwotka, wrote to the Prime Minister and to the First Ministers of the devolved nations to announce the ballot result and, to invite them back to the negotiating table to see if we could end what was going to become a pay dispute. At that time, Nicola Sturgeon replied to the General Secretary of PCS and delegated authority to the Deputy First Minister at the time and Scottish Government officials to come back to the negotiating table to try and resolve the dispute. Now, the reason this is important is because since Thatcher destroyed national pay bargaining decades ago, we have, as other unions have, been in a situation where we are in delegated pay talks every single year. So under the Scottish Government's pay policy, we have to do 40 odd pay talks every year, even though the Scottish Government are ultimately the people, they're the paymaster, they have the money to resolve disputes. And what happened at this point was that the talks that we entered into to end our dispute were national bargaining talks. They were sectoral pay talks. And that allowed us, as the representatives and the negotiators of all these members on strike, to sit down with government officials, with the delegated authority of the First Minister, to look at a sectoral agreement to end this dispute. And we really noticed at that time that there was a bit of an Overton window moment for us because we had done the work on educating members on the 4-day week. We had done the research. We had pushed this at local level. We'd pushed this at government level. And we had an opportunity, and this is why I've concluded these photos here, to use our industrial leverage at that time. These were solid picket lines, 80, 90% votes for industrial action, to force the government to not only give a supplementary pay offer on pay, and to increase the pay award of the pay offer, but also to finally make moves on working time. So these negotiations resulted in a sectoral collective agreement that included reductions in working time as well as an increase in pay. So in most employers under the Scottish Government's pay policy, what the working time element of that was that there was an introduction of a wellbeing hour that basically was a non-contractual wellbeing hour that took working time from 37 to 36 hours. However, as part of those negotiations, 3 organisations, and it was the Scottish Prison Service, the National Museums of Scotland and the National Galleries of Scotland, said, we're not going to implement a wellbeing hour because these are really highly operational organisations where there's a lot of like public facing or front facing roles, and the amount of work that they would have to do to move to 36 and then later move to 35, because that's where that's where things were going at that point. They said they would rather work with the unions to move straight to 35 hours. And as part of the pay deal, the Scottish Government committed financial support to the National Galleries and the National Museums of Scotland to do this. So by this point, we are in like April 2023. And over the next year or so, PCS negotiating teams worked with management in the National Galleries and National Museums of Scotland to do that, to have basically a year of full consultation on how you can reduce working time and then look to implement that. In the National Museums, but the National Galleries specifically is who I'm going to speak to. This was a truly progressive bottom-up process over a year of engaging PCS members and workers to look at how do you reduce working time in a meaningful way that means that you're going to really enjoy the benefit of that reduction in working time. And in the National Galleries of Scotland, our PCS reps, I can't pay testament enough to what they managed to achieve. So in the security department, a lot of them work in security. They negotiated through management, but from their membership, a roster that moved them from 42 hours a week to a 4-on, 4-off rota that basically they work 33.6 hours a week with no loss of pay, no detriment at all. And there's 6 floating days that they work a year that makes them up to an annualised 35-hour contract every week. Across the wider sector, in the 2023-24 pay negotiations that came the following year, those employers that had implemented the wellbeing hour progressed to then basically committing to implementing a contractual 35-hour week. I'm going to need to be clear on all of this because it is amazing and like the wins on this are incredible. We've been talking at this point about working time for the best part of a decade, and we have a supposedly progressive Scottish government, right? But it took the worst cost of living crisis in decades and the subsequent wave of industrial action to actually get us to finally move to a 35-hour week, not even a 4-day week. And again, that is absolute testament to the PCS members who came out on strike during 2022. So in addition to the 35-hour week, in October 2023, the Scottish Government's public sector pilot of a 4-day 32-hour week started, and it started in an organisation called South of Scotland Enterprise. And in spring 2024, another organisation called Accountant and Bankruptcy joined the pilot. So these pilots, I'm sure you'll know, are being run by Autonomy, and PCS reps and members in both of these organisations have been involved in these. Now, the South of Scotland Enterprise pilot has now been extended twice, and the results from these pilots so far, not all the results are available yet, but the results so far are incredibly positive, in terms of like workers' well-being. There's, high support and positive improvements to people's well-being in terms of like how they feel at work, their motivation levels, and their absence from work. And the reports from these pilots are due in spring, and certainly that will, that's something that we'll be looking at. In early 2024, the Scottish Parliament, so the Scottish Parliament does not come under the pay policy of the Scottish Government. And, the Scottish Parliament itself, as I'm sure you can imagine, is a very unique working environment given, parliamentary business and supporting MSPs. And in the pay negotiations that PCS and our sister civil service trade unions did in 2024, we won a 35-hour week as part of them. So for years, we had been encouraging the Scottish Parliament to follow suit and to work with Autonomy, given the challenges and the unique working environment. And I'm very pleased to say that as part of those pay negotiations in 2024, they finally committed to doing that. And they are currently engaged with Autonomy. And again, our PCS reps and members are engaged in that piece of work just now to look at how they can reduce working time. And they have committed to doing that by March 2026. So where we are now is that PCS members in the Scottish Devolved sector have won the 35-hour week. However, there still is some work to be done on that. As I've said, there's some employers who are really good examples of implementing this properly and doing the work to ensure that it's a meaningful reduction in working time. But in others, it's not been implemented that well. For example, there's been people that couldn't do their jobs in 37 hours, never mind 35, and nothing's really changed for them. And PCS reps and negotiators are working now to ensure that where those issues exist, that they are resolved and that they're resolved really quickly. We are currently awaiting, like I've said, the publication of the pilot results from South of Scotland Enterprise and Accounting and Bankruptcy, and this will inform the next steps of our campaign, which is now to push from 35 hours over 5 days to 4 days, 28 hours with no loss of pay or terms and conditions. And really notably for us, we are a year and a month away from the Scottish Parliament elections in 2026. And, like I've said, we have got 3 of our main political parties who have the 4-day week as part of their manifestos. And it will be for PCS members over the next year to use their industrial leverage to hold those politicians to account before we all vote for them next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I've made so many notes while you were speaking. So we now invite questions to Ruby. You can either sort of write them in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and ask them yourself. I have written down a number of questions, and I'm just gonna sort of start. Quite interesting. My first question is very practical. How did you, because a lot of the time, we have a number of academics in this meeting at the moment who are working on work time reduction, the 4-day work week, and we're publishing all of these papers. And we rarely reach out maybe to the kind of people that we were interested in. So you said that the report that you made with Autonomy, especially the first one you were talking about there, you worked a lot on making it accessible. Could you tell us a little bit on how you made this work accessible? How did you make it sort of not just a report, but something that had impact for your members and broader?
I think that probably for the report to have impact, there had to be a degree of ownership of it, and that had to come from the people that the report was about. You know, we've done things in the past where we've had reports written by academics, which is so useful to us, you know, on things like tax justice, for example, but nobody owns that. The academics own it. And so for us to be able to go out and
Mm.
build power and build workers' power, they need to feel like there's ownership over the topics that are discussed in that literature. So I would say that that was probably the most important thing was, you know, autonomy were amazing with that. You know, we were very clear, like, this is obviously your report, but we want this to be led by the workforce and we want it to then be generating conversation and for people to get agitated around it. And that worked because it generated so much conversation in the Scottish Government. We have thousands of union members in the Scottish Government. And then it worked on a wider basis as well, because then people were going out and they were like, look at this report. This is about my job. You do a kind of similar job. And I would say that that's the thing that generated the most impact. It wasn't an abstract idea, it was about them and their work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm just sitting here making notes. So one of the things you were talking about, you've obviously done this during a couple of years that has been quite tumultuous. There's been a lot of other things happening, which to a certain degree has helped the movement. One of the things that I've found when I've done interviews with managers and with workers is a lot of the time when you start working talking about work time reduction, they a lot of people automatically associate this with pay cuts or austerity. Is that because you talked a little bit about the sort of challenges over there? How have you found this, and how do you overcome this?
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting for us here because, you know, I have to be honest, a lot of the time when we talk about these issues, so progressive industrial issues, we are swinging at an open door with Scottish ministers. You know, again, no matter what you think of them, the SNP are not the Tories, right? And
Mm.
I'm not saying that that means they're left wing or they're progressive, but they have got, and as do the opposition parties, a 4-day week as part of their manifesto. And so it does mean that we're not engaged in a hostile debate about working time versus pay. I'm not saying that that's not where we might get one day. And there are examples in Scotland, actually, I think it's Aberdeen Council that have implemented a shorter working week, but there's been a pay freeze. We've never found ourselves in a situation where we've had to have a discussion about one or the other because I cannot ever see a reality, and this is obviously for PCS members to vote upon, where we will ever forego protecting people's living standards through pay for a shorter working week. But yeah, it's just not been a conversation that we've had to have. And I think again, ultimately I come back to it was the power of the PCS members who took part in industrial action that we were able to leverage the Scottish Government like that. And again, it ties into that thing of the SNP and the Scottish Government really want to seem better than the UK
Mm.
government.
I mean, that's not hard a point, is it?
Yeah.
Sorry, I should not say that in the recorded. India, please do. Otherwise, I'm going to continue with my list of questions for Oban.
Thanks very much, Ruby. Super, super interesting, and thank you for laying that all out. Yeah, I suppose I was thinking about next steps, I suppose, for PCS on this. I know that there's a 32-hour week trial has been happening. Do you feel like that trial has kind of opened the door for potentially kind of the further reductions across the board from the 35 hours, or do you think the kind of 2-hour reduction that's already been achieved is kind of pretty like major in terms of the employers' perspectives on it, and therefore like it's going to take a longer time to kind of get to that 32 change as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question because the political tide has kind of shifted a bit. So since these commitments were made and these negotiations were had, even the SNP's leadership has changed. You know, it has went from Nicola Sturgeon and Hamza Yousaf, who would have been seen as the more progressive, like liberal side of the party, to John Swinney and Kate Forbes, right, who's like actually right wing. And I think that what we also have, again, previously, when all of this took place a couple of years ago, was a very clear distinction between the Tories and the Scottish Government. We now have a Labour Party in government, and again, no matter what you think of them, objectively, they are not being progressive or nearly as progressive as everyone would have thought they might be on industrial matters. And I don't know if that starts to lower the bar for the Scottish Government in a way. They will still want to appear better than, but they don't have as such a low bar as they had before with the Tories. So it's a bit of a changed picture. In terms of the more like local feel across these employers, so certainly for the organisations like the museums and the galleries and the Scottish Prison Service as well, there was significant financial investment in the museums and the galleries to get them to a 35-hour week because a lot of their staff, the majority of their staff are like gallery attendants. If you go into like the National Galleries and it's the people that will show you around or be on the reception desk, you can't reduce their working time easily by making productivity gains. So there had to be investment for actual like recruitment. Sorry, I just got distracted by that chat. For these organisations, I can see when the time comes a conversation being had of we just implemented a 35-hour week a year ago and it took a year of resource intensive work and hell of a lot of money. In other organisations, though, so we have these two pilots going on in South of Scotland Enterprise and Accountant and Bankruptcy. These are two small, quite back office type organisations. There will be a push, and a very, very justifiable push in the short term to move a lot of organisations that are similar to them to do the same thing. But it's a bit of a scattered picture across the employers that we negotiate with because you do have a vast number of office-based, back office-based roles, but you also have all quite heavy operational areas like the courts, for example. Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service employs thousands of people, and similar to what I've just said about the National Galleries and museums, how do you reduce their working time when these people actually work in courts? So, yeah, it's definitely something that is on my mind. We built for this for years. We took the opportunity during the cost of living crisis to make wins on this. As part of those negotiations, we members won that, and some of that is still being implemented now. And like I say, there's some imperfections and that are still being fixed in that. But how do we progress this over the next 5 years, given that the landscape is changing, it's shifting to the right, even in Scotland? There's a continued attacks on public sector finances. There's no progressive radical alternatives being implemented by governments to increase money for funding. But at the same time, there is a 4-day week pilot going on that was initiated by the government. And when the findings of that come out, it's going to put the government in quite a tricky situation, I think, because these are two government organisations, one of which actually is analogous to the Scottish Government as an employer's terms and conditions. So in accounting and bankruptcy, if they implemented a 4-day, 32-hour week, there is then a contractual anomaly because they are one of like 30 employers that are completely analogous to the terms and conditions of the Scottish Government. So all of this is going to there's going to be a lot of tension in some of this over the next couple of months. Can you give me 2 seconds? I need to go and get my charger because somebody stole it and my laptop's about to run out of battery. 2 seconds.
Absolutely. I think that has happened to all of us. I have myself been in the middle of a talk at some point where all the media just died. You just have to make it work. I've seen that we have a couple of questions here in the chat, and I'm gonna post them when we've solved our technical issue. While we are waiting, I'll just remind people that we are recording these webinars and we will be uploading this to our website. So if there's something where you're like, oh, what was it that she said, or something that you want to maybe bring up in one of your own negotiations or your own art, you'll be able to sort of go back and see what was said. Okay, perfect. So I was going to try to plug our next webinar. So our next webinar is on the 30th of April. We have sent out, I think, links about that one, and it's the ESC opinion, working time, the efficiency of the economy and well-being of workers.
Sorry, everyone.
Welcome
I
back.
just had to run around the office looking for a charger.
Oh, don't worry, I used the time to plug some other things. We've had a couple of questions here in the chat, and I'm going to take them in a bit of a different order, because some of them are more clarification questions and some of them are a bit longer. So we have one question here from Landa saying that you mentioned that 3 out of 4 prominent political parties in Scotland has included a 4-day working week in their manifesto. And was that for the public sector or also for the private sector?
I think it's just, I don't know the like total answer on that, but I think it's just that they support a 4-day week generally.
So
I would
yeah,
look into that.
both public and private. Perfect. Then we have some longer questions, and I'm going to start with the vet's question here.
Sure.
So lots of compliments in the beginning, and then a clarification that she works for a Dutch union. And you mentioned in your talk that work time reduction has recruited new members. Do you have any sort of idea of how many new members that you recruited? Like what did you have at the start before this, and how many did you recruit afterwards? Yeah, and then some information about the situation. They are currently doing 36 hours, trying to go to 32 hours with full pay. And yeah, I think she'd just be interested in connecting with you after.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's fine. My email address is just Ruby, RUBY. I'll put in the chat. So in terms of the recruitment, so during the autonomy project, I don't know the numbers, but I know from the PCS representatives, like senior officials that were involved in that at the time, there was a constant stream of people joining the union during the project. And there was also people coming forward who were longer standing union members but wanted to get involved. We have a role in PCS called an advocate role. So it's for people who maybe don't want to take on a formal rep role but are interested in helping out a bit and spreading the word about the union, and people came on as advocates. But certainly across the Scottish sector, employers, when we were doing this work, there was, anecdotal chat about people joining the union because they were seeing that we were doing things on a 4-day week and being really interested in that. I just don't have the numbers to hand. We didn't track anything again because there's so much spread across different employers. We wouldn't have been able to say for sure in the numbers and the data that it was because of the 4-day week, but there was definitely anecdotal evidence of that at the time.
Could try to run a regression, I was going to say, but that's the economist in me. And had another here, again, very interesting case. They're wondering a little bit here. Erica is asking about, to what extent did you measure performance and output? Because you said you have some industries where this is a bit problematic, and in the areas where you observed these kind of things, is it accepted if the performance is somewhat lower in now 35 hours compared to 37?
Yeah, it's a good question, Erica. So just to be clear, when we did the autonomy project, that was just like a discussion based, would this be feasible? Would it be desirable? There was never a trial or pilot in 2021. With regard to the 35-hour week and the work that we did with employers to implement that, so I can speak to directly the National Galleries and the National Museums because I was the negotiator who worked on that with our PCS reps. When we did the work over a year leading up to the implementation, and there was a lot of engagement with members and with what the wider staff force, there was things like surveys. And at that point, that showed us where people said, yeah, I can do my work in 35 hours, if I just like streamline meetings or my manager decides as a team, we're going to cut some meetings by 15 minutes, I can probably do that, no problem. But what it also showed was there was a few areas in some of these organisations that were like, absolutely not. Like, I am not working 37 hours just now. I can't work 35. There's been long-standing capacity issues in my team. Either you need to recruit or you need to reprioritize. And there was some chat from employers when they were looking at implementing the 35-hour week where there did just have to be a reprioritization as an organisation to say, okay, well, we support this progressive initiative. We want people to work a bit less and be healthier and enjoy their life more. We have to make some changes and we might just have to reprioritize some of the work that people are getting. So that definitely is a conversation that took place for the 35-hour week. In the 4-day week, 4-day 32-hour week pilots that are still going on at the moment, I'm not entirely sure what's happened in their autonomy would be best placed to comment on that. But I do know, or I have heard that the productivity in these pilots has not been adversely affected by reducing working time.
Thank you. Daniel, you've asked a question, and I hope I understand this correct. Otherwise, please feel free to come in and clarify. Business opposition is an obstacle to achieving this reduction in working hours. Is the 4-day work week with the same? Oh yeah, with the do you mean with the same number of working hours? Do you mean a compressed work week? Sorry there, Daniel, I'm not. Do you want to clarify? No, I understand I put you a little bit on the spot here, but just don't want to ask the
Yes,
question.
sure. This is my question. It's the same time during the week, but compression in 4 weeks, because sometimes it's difficult to ask for this kind of 31 hours. We have in Spain a very good, very big problem with the business, because we reduce by law this time of work, but there's a lot of opposition of the right parties and the business world about this. It's a solution in the beginning, and after that, when the productivity will be the same, we can change. Sorry for my English, it's very bad, but I can.
No, perfectly.
I try to understand, to make me understand. Okay.
No,
It's a
thank you
beginning
so much.
to
Thank you.
manage the same time during the week in 4 days, and if the productivity becomes better, we can negotiate it after a reduction of time.
I think this is an interesting question. There's quite a lot of sort of discussion around compression versus actual work time reduction. Ruby, what is your position on compression versus work time reduction?
Daniel, you're right. Alex, it's a really important point right now, because I think that anyone who's interested in the 4-day week, 4-day 32-hour week, like the proper 4-day week, needs to be really careful with the language that we use about things like compressed hours. Because right now, for example, the UK Labour Party are putting a bill through the UK Parliament, and it's an employment rights bill. Now, when the Labour Party, for example, were campaigning to get into government, as other parties do during an election period, they say that they're really progressive and they promise all these things, and there certainly are politicians, for example, and I'm just using them as an example, who support a real 4-day week, a true 4-day, 32-hour, 30-hour, 28-hour week. And what has now transpired is their 4-day week is compressed hours, and is to give everyone the right to be able to apply for compressed hours. Now, that's not a real 4-day week, and I think it's on anyone who supports this to be using language and educating people on a 4-day week is a 4-day, 32-hour less week with no loss of pay, and about building people's expectations that they can win this, and people have won it, and people have it, and it's got, benefits for workers and business alike. And that is so well evidenced across the whole world now, because you're right, we're seeing happen now is almost like a capitulation to the right wing of, oh, well, we support a 4-day week, 4-day 32-hour week, but the easy thing to do is to kind of dress this up and actually just implement the right to have condensed hours, which is not a 4-day week. Loads of people work 4-day condensed hour weeks. I do it as well. You know, it's great, but it's a flexible working option, and it's a flexible working option that has been available to people for years. It generally started as an option available to parents. You know, when flexible working legislation, for example, came in the UK, it was more geared up towards people with parental responsibility or caring responsibility. And over recent years, that has been broadened out because it's obviously a positive thing to everyone, not just if you have kids. But condensed hours is not a 4-day week, and we have to ensure that that message is getting out to people. And again, there will be people who are skeptical or worried about it or have loads of questions, and it's about just assuring people that there is another option, and that is a 4-day, 32-hour week with no loss of pay. And to anybody right wing out there are business benefits to that as well, not just the work hours.
Thank you so much. I think that's a super good answer to a very complicated question. So I see there is a question there about the health sector. It might be hard, I guess, for you to say something about the health sector because it's not really the area of your union. But we have a related question here from Alex saying that with regards to the kind of occupations where you need people to be physically present, you've been talking about the museum staff and galleries and similar. They talk here about that other areas such as nursing have seen that to compensate for the lack of time, because people now work fewer hours, they had to hire more people, but the lower turnover in staff and the lesser sort of absence through sickness and stuff has almost covered these kinds of costs.
Yep.
Have you seen any changes to the turnover within galleries, museums, or those areas? Have you seen anything in these types of savings?
So no, we've not seen anything yet because there's not been an evaluation done on the 35-hour week yet. Some of these organisations only moved in like October last year, but there is an evaluation template that has been sent out by the Scottish Government that we've had input into to these employers, and it's definitely something that we are going to look at. It's something as well that we used, as a kind of negotiating like piece, I suppose, in the lead up to this, to say there may be an upfront cost, you're absolutely right, but when you look at the long-term benefits and the cost of higher retention, less presenteeism, then it would be it would be short-sighted to not consider that over a longer term. It's a very interesting point because in the Scottish Parliament, so as I said, they were one of the last ones to negotiate a reduction in working time with us in March or April last year. And as part of the written agreement on this, they have effectively said that they want to do this on a cost neutral basis. Now, there is a bit of money aside for it, but it's nothing in the grand scheme of like the scope and breadth of the Parliament and the amount of people they have doing all these different jobs. And something I was really clear with them on is that, again, don't be short-sighted about this, because what exactly does cost neutral mean? You need to be able to define that, because if you're looking at cost neutrality over a year, okay, right, you could spend £300,000 and you think cost neutral, but if you look at the benefits of that over the next 5 years in terms of increased well-being resulting in less absence resulting in increased retention, then you could make that money back. And additionally, actually, I didn't answer part of the first question. There were retention issues in one of the culture organisations, quite high turnover. I haven't looked at that since because I do a different role now. But yeah, that's definitely one of the selling points in terms of being able to retain staff. And over the next year or so, we're going to start gathering more data on what has been the impact of the 35-hour week in terms of things like staff turnover.
It is really interesting that people want to keep everything on a cost neutral. So on one hand, we're spending loads of money trying to deal with unemployment. On the other hand, we refuse to accept that work time reduction, hiring more people might actually have a relationship between the two. But yeah, absolutely. There's things that can be said there. Do we have any more questions? We have a little bit more time. Have a question here again, Alex asking, could you say a little bit how overtime is handled or plans on how it would be handled?
Yeah, so during the negotiations, it was very interesting for me to be, and when you win something, you're like, yes, we've won, and then you actually have to negotiate how it's going to work, and there's all these things that you haven't thought about, and it was such a learning. It's like the whole last few years has been such a learning curve for everyone that's been involved in this. So okay, so firstly, it was practically how do you implement a 35-hour week? So how does Ruby, who works in the galleries, who does 37 hours, how do we ensure that they still fulfill the operational requirement, but only on 35 hours? Or if they're part-time, how do you ensure that they can work 15 minutes? Because some people worked, like 10 hours a week, so that the change was only like 5 minutes. And that was quite an interesting dynamic in itself, because suddenly you had kind of different groups of workers who some were getting a reduction of like the security staff from 42 hours, and some people worked 15 hours and they were only getting a reduction of like 45 minutes. And you had to be really careful to not drive up any us and them situation and people starting to feel negatively about each other. It was quite a minefield at times. And then after that was all straightened out and everyone knew, okay, you're going to be working this many hours now, or this is your shift pattern now, we then had to get into a contractual negotiation about this, because if anybody's terms and conditions were going to be changed, which they were, to 35 hours, and some people who were shift workers had to have their shifts, their contractual shifts changed, we had to look at things like how does it affect overtime? How does it affect like annual leave allowance? So basically, in terms of overtime, for example, if there was a contractual entitlement to an overtime rate after 37 hours, that just changed to 35 hours. So if you were entitled to, for example, time and a half over any hours worked over 37, those people are now entitled to time and a half over 35 hours, because that's the new full-time hours. And similar with annual leave. Again, this was interesting. So annual leave is mostly expressed in days. What all the employers did is they basically just expressed the annual leave in hours instead of days. And they made a very slight proportionate adjustment. So, before your annual leave allowance was based on you working a 37-hour week, it's now based on a 35-hour week. So you still get the same amount of days. It's just that the hours were proportionately adjusted for that 2-hour reduction in working time.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think these are we should almost try at some part of the network to share these kind of things really broadly, because it's so practical. And we're going to see this in so many countries, in so many industries. And why reinvent the wheel? Um, mm, 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 mm. But if people are talking about, yeah, exactly. So Alex commented here, if people are talking about logistics detail rather than discussing it, it's already a win. And thank you so much, Ruby. Thank you to everyone that has been participating, asking questions and everything. We have 4 minutes until the end of the session. And if most of you are in a similar situation like me, you have a meeting you're going to go straight into. So I'm going to round off today's session. We posted, and as I mentioned in the little break when Ruby ran away, we have a next webinar coming up on the 30th of April on the EESC opinion on working time. I'm sure that is going to be a really, really great session as well. Ruby has posted her email in the chat, and now I'm just inviting people to contact you, Ruby, if you have any questions. But yeah, India, is there anything else that you think we need to mention? No, a little shake there. Then thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And thank you again, Ruby. Hope your travels down to Wales go well, and that you're not getting stuck in one of your 4 changes.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Ruby. Thanks,
Bye.
Alex. See everyone soon.